Rain had been falling since noon on the day the war finally released Edmund back to Blackwood, and it was still falling thin and cold when the carriage lamp swung into view at the end of the long drive, throwing wet gold light across the gravel, and the assembled staff who had stood waiting in the damp for the better part of an hour because a stable boy had spotted dust on the London road. And no one had dared tell the housekeeper the Duke might simply be delayed again, as he had been delayed so many times before. Duchess Rosalind Hartley stood at the top of the steps in her plainest wool, her hair pinned back without ornament because she had long ago stopped dressing for a husband who was not there to see it. And when the carriage door opened and Edmund stepped down first, offering his gloved hand not to his own wife, but to a woman in crimson silk who descended after him laughing at some private joke, Rosalind felt the whole staff around her go still in the particular way a room goes still just before someone is struck. "Edmund," she said, and her voice carried across the wet gravel with a composure she did not entirely feel. "You might have written ahead. I would have prepared a second bedchamber." The woman in crimson silk laughed again, softer this time, cruel in its softness, and said loudly enough that the housekeeper flinched, "How very domestic of you. Duchess, I do hope you won't mind sharing the household a little longer." Rosalind did not look at her. She looked instead at her husband, at the tired, guarded face of a man she had married for duty and had once foolishly hoped to love, and she said the words that would travel from that gravel drive to every parlour in the county before the month was out. "Keep your mistress, your grace. I no longer need your name to survive it. If you have ever stood in the rain and watched someone you trusted, choose your humiliation over your dignity in front of a room full of witnesses. You already know the particular cold that settles into a person's spine in that moment, and if you want to see exactly how far a discarded woman can rise once she stops waiting for anyone's permission, stay with this story to the very end, because what came after that carriage ride would humble a duke and crown a draper's daughter. And neither of them saw it coming. Comment the city you're watching from. Subscribe if you believe truth outlasts cruelty every single time it is tested. And let us go back 3 years, before the war, before the Mistress, before any of it. To the girl Rosalind Hartley was when she owned nothing in the world but her mother's old letters and a spine of iron she had not yet learned to use. She had been born the only daughter of a modest wool draper in the market town of Ashendell, a man of quiet decency who taught her figures at the kitchen table by candlelight, because he believed, against the prevailing wisdom of the town, that a mind for numbers was worth more to a daughter than a talent for embroidery. He was not a wealthy man, but he was an honest one, and the shop provided enough that Rosalind grew up with full plates and warm shoes, which she would later understand had been its own quiet fortune. All of it ended in a single night in her 17th year, when a lamp overturned in the storeroom and the fire took the shop, the stock, and within a month, through the smoke that had settled permanently in his lungs, her father's health as well. She buried him in the churchyard behind Ashendell's small stone chapel on a grey morning in early spring, and by summer she had been sent, with what remained of her mother's small trunk of belongings, to the household of a distant cousin who had agreed to take her in only after being reminded, at some length, of what family obligation required. Her cousin's household was not cruel in the dramatic way of storybooks, but in the smaller, grinding way that wears a person down over years rather than moments, treating her as a poor relation useful for her neat hand at correspondence and her talent with figures, but never once as family. She was given the smallest bedchamber, the plainest meals, and a standing reminder, delivered at least once a week by her cousin's wife, that she ought to be grateful for a roof that was not, strictly speaking, owed to her. Rosalind kept the accounts no one else wished to keep, mended linens no one else wished to mend, and endured, without complaint, the particular indignity of being spoken over at her own dinner table by people who had once called her father a friend worth visiting. It was her cousin's husband, a man of modest fortune and considerable ambition. who first saw an opportunity in the fact that his household's unwanted relation possessed a face that turned heads and a manner that, however plain her dress, could not entirely hide her breeding. He arranged, through a solicitor acquaintance, an introduction to Edmund, Duke of Blackwood, whose ancient estate had been bled dry by a father who preferred the card tables of London to the responsibilities of his tenants, and whose need for capital was by that point considerably more urgent than his interest in romance. Rosalind's own father, it emerged, had quietly and carefully saved a modest sum against his daughter's future for the whole of his working life, a sum her cousin had never mentioned to her, and had, in fact, been managing on her behalf with rather more enthusiasm for its growth than for her welfare. And it was this sum, modest by the standards of the aristocracy, but sufficient to steady a drowning estate, that made Rosalind, briefly and unexpectedly, a marriageable prospect for a duke. Edmund was polite when they met, correct in every particular, neither warm nor cold, but carefully, deliberately neutral, like a man conducting an interview rather than a courtship. He kissed her hand at their wedding in a small chapel attended by more of his creditors' solicitors than his own family, and within a month he had rejoined his regiment and departed for the continent, leaving Rosalind alone in a house, larger and colder than any she had ever imagined, belonging to her. He wrote perhaps 6 letters in 3 years, each shorter than the last, each so formal in its language that Rosalind came to keep them not from sentiment but from habit, the way one keeps receipts for goods long since consumed. She might have spent the whole of that solitary war disappearing quietly into the vast cold rooms of Blackwood, had a stranger not collapsed against the estate's iron gates on a bitter January evening. Half frozen, and leaning heavily on a cane, he clearly resented needing, asking the startled gatekeeper for nothing more than shelter until the worst of the storm had passed. The household staff, wary of vagrants and deserters in those uncertain years, wished to turn him away into the night. But Rosalind, who remembered too well what it felt to be turned from a door that could easily have opened, overruled them and ordered him brought into the gatehouse, fed and warmed, and sat with him herself long enough to be satisfied he was neither drunk nor dangerous, only exhausted in the particular way of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. He gave his name as Gabriel Thorne, said he had served as a quartermaster's clerk before a wound to his hip ended his usefulness in the field, and asked only for honest work in exchange for his keep until he was fit to travel further. It was old Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper who had served at Blackwood since before Rosalind's own wedding, and who trusted almost no one on principle, who grumbled loudest against keeping a stranger in the house, and then, within a fortnight, was seen bringing him a second helping of stew without being asked, muttering that a man who thanked the kitchen staff by name was not, in her considerable experience, a man worth turning out into the cold. Rosalind offered Gabriel Thorne a position in the estate office within a month, not out of charity, but out of necessity, for she had noticed, in the careful way she had learned to notice things in her cousin's household, that the family steward, a narrow and watchful man named Silas Crane, who had served the old Duke and been questioned by no one since, kept ledgers that did not quite add up to the harvests and rents they claimed to describe. Gabriel read faster than any clerk she had known, asked careful and precise questions, and remembered every answer he was given, and in the long quiet evenings of that first winter, going over accounts together by firelight while the wind howled against the old windows, Rosalind found herself, against every intention she had for herself, listening for the particular unhurried sound of his footsteps on the stair before she admitted to herself that she was listening at all. Their friendship grew the way frost grows across a window pane in the deep of winter, so slowly and so quietly that neither of them could later name the precise night it became something else. Entirely. Built not out of grand gestures, but out of the accumulation of small ones. He never once asked what her marriage was like, and she never once asked what had truly happened to his hip. And in the careful silence between those unasked questions, there grew a trust that surprised them both by its steadiness. There came an evening, some months into that arrangement, when Rosalind rode out alone to visit the tenant farms along the eastern boundary of the estate, a habit the previous steward had actively discouraged and Crane had forbidden outright, claiming it was unbecoming of a duchess to concern herself with such matters directly. She found, in speaking plainly with the Hartley family who worked the largest of the eastern farms, that the rent they had paid that quarter bore no resemblance to the figure recorded in Crane's own books, a discrepancy of nearly a third, and when she returned to the estate office white-faced with the discovery, it was Gabriel who calmly suggested, without alarm, that she begin keeping her own private ledger alongside the official one, recording every payment she witnessed with her own eyes rather than relying on Crane's account of it. "A man who is stealing quietly," he told her, setting down his pen with the particular deliberate care he brought to everything, "counts on no one else keeping their own sums. Keep yours, and one day his will have nowhere left to hide." It was advice that would prove, before the year was out, to be the difference between her ruin and her survival, though neither of them yet understood how narrow that margin would be. It was in the depths of that same winter, searching through a locked writing box that had belonged to her mother and had sat untouched in the attics since Rosalind's arrival at Blackwood, that she found a bundle of papers bound with faded ribbon, bearing a wax seal she did not recognize, and a name, Ashford, that she had never once heard spoken in her childhood home. The letters, once carefully deciphered through her mother's small, precise hand, revealed a truth that quietly rearranged everything Rosalind had believed about her own modest birth. Her mother, it emerged, had not been born a draper's wife at all, but the younger daughter of the Baron of Ashford, disowned and struck entirely from the family record for the crime of marrying a tradesman she loved, rather than the titled match her own father had arranged, her name never again spoken beneath that roof. The current Baron, Rosalind's own uncle by blood, a man she had never once met, had died 2 years past without issue, and by the strict and ancient terms of the barony's entail, its title and considerable holdings in the northern counties passed not to any distant male cousin, as the family's solicitors had long assumed, but to the nearest surviving descendant of the old baron's own children, a line that ran, unbroken and undisputed by any competing claim, directly and inescapably to Rosalind herself. She sat with the letters spread across her lap until the candle guttered to nothing, and in the morning she showed them, with trembling hands, to the one person at Blackwood she trusted enough to see her trembling at all. Gabriel read them twice through in complete silence, and when he finally looked up, there was an expression on his face she had not seen there before, something between wonder and a grief he did not yet explain. "Then you were never truly without a name at all," he said quietly. "You have simply been waiting all this while for the world to notice the one you already carried." She did not yet understand why the words seemed to cost him something to say, though she would come to understand it soon enough. The Duke's return, when it finally arrived that rain-soaked evening, brought with it none of the warning that ordinary decency might have suggested, and Camille Duval, the woman he had brought home upon his arm, made her intentions plain within her very first week beneath Blackwood's roof. She installed herself in the finest of the guest apartments, without so much as a request for permission, sent for her trunks to be unpacked by maids she addressed as though they already answered to her, and took to correcting the housekeeper's arrangements at dinner with a familiarity that left poor Mrs. Pruitt scandalized into uncharacteristic silence. Rosalind learned soon enough, through the careful and sympathetic gossip of a young lady's maid who had grown fond of her mistress over 3 lonely years, that Camille had attached herself to Edmund during the final year of the campaign, first as a camp follower celebrated for her charm among the officers, and later as something considerably more permanent, and that she had spent the long weeks of the voyage home, carefully persuading the Duke that a quiet annulment, settled swiftly and before anyone thought to trace the Ashford inheritance now quietly attached to his wife, would leave him both unencumbered and considerably richer for the trouble. Edmund summoned Rosalind to his study within a fortnight of his homecoming, seated behind the same desk his father had once gambled from, and informed her, in the same flat and courteous tone he might have used to discuss the condition of the stables, that his solicitors believed sufficient grounds existed to void the marriage on a technicality buried in the original settlement, and that she would, of course, be provided for once the matter was properly concluded. Rosalind sat very still through the whole of it, and when he finished she asked him only a single question. "Does she know," she said, "that it was my father's savings, and no fortune of your own, that kept this house from the creditors while you were gone?" The Duke said nothing at all, and his silence answered the question more completely than any words could have managed. It did not take Rosalind long, once she began truly looking, to discover that Silas Crane had been quietly feeding Camille Duval detailed accounts of the estate's finances for the better part of a month. Each conversation, carried out in low voices near the granary, where the pair believed themselves unobserved, though a sharp-eyed stable hand named Tom, no older than 14, and fiercely devoted to Gabriel after months of being taught his letters in the estate office in the evenings, had overheard rather more than either of them realized, and reported it, wide-eyed, to the one adult in the household he trusted completely. Crane's hope, it became clear, was that a fast annulment, settled before Rosalind's own careful private ledger could ever be set beside his official one, would bury 3 years of quiet theft beneath the noise of a scandal no one would think to look past. Matters grew worse within days. When Rosalind discovered that a strong box containing her mother's original letters and the earliest correspondence confirming the Ashford succession had been forced open in the night, its contents disturbed, though not, providentially, entirely removed, a clumsy attempt at sabotage that told her plainly just how frightened her enemies had become of what those papers might yet prove. For one long and terrible evening after that discovery, alone in her chambers with the fire burned down to embers and her chambermaid dismissed for the night, Rosalind came closer to despair than she had allowed herself to come since the winter her father died, sitting in the dark, because she could not bear for the servants to see that she had finally, after 3 years of quiet endurance, begun to weep. It was Gabriel who found her there in that darkness, having noticed her absence from the evening accounts, and grown uneasy enough to seek her out against every rule of propriety the household observed. And it was Gabriel who finally told her, in that same dim and fire-lit room, the truth he had carried silently since the very night she had first shown him her mother's letters. He was not, and had never truly been, a wounded clerk seeking shelter from a winter storm. He was Gabriel Thorne Stirling, Earl of Stirling, a title senior to the Duke's own by 2 full generations of unbroken succession, and he had come to Blackwood under a borrowed name, not to deceive her, but to escape, for a season, a society that had treated him since his wounding as either an object of pity or a prize to be won by ambitious mothers angling their daughters towards his fortune. Never once as simply a man worth knowing for himself. "I did not tell you," he said, his voice low and unsteady, in a way she had never heard from him before, "because for the first time since I came home from that war, I wanted, however selfishly, to be wanted for nothing but myself. And because I have loved you, Rosalind, for longer than either of us has had the courage to admit aloud." She did not answer him with words at all. She answered him by placing her hand in his, and in that small cold room, with the whole of Blackwood arrayed against her, and the fire burned nearly to nothing, she understood for the first time in 3 years exactly what it felt to be truly and completely seen by another person. There was little time left to rest in that understanding, for the Duke's solicitors moved with unseemly haste once the strong-box had been disturbed, fixing a date for a formal hearing before the county's ecclesiastical court within the fortnight, and Camille, growing careless in her mounting confidence, had begun openly wearing a sapphire brooch that Rosalind recognized instantly as belonging to the Blackwood family vault, a piece she had certainly never given permission to be removed. It was sterling, using the considerable weight of a rank that Gabriel Thorne could never have claimed, who set the full machinery of proof into motion, dispatching riders north to the Ashford solicitors to confirm the succession beyond any shadow of contest, writing to officers who had served alongside the Duke and could speak plainly to the exact circumstances of Camille's attachment to his household, and quietly interviewing, with careful discretion, the tenants and staff of Blackwood who had watched Crane's ledgers for years and had simply never once been asked what they had privately noticed. A groundskeeper recalled repairs invoiced in detail and never once performed. The Hartley family of the Eastern Farm confirmed, in a signed statement, the very rent discrepancy Rosalind had first uncovered that autumn afternoon. Young Tom, the stable hand, solemn with the importance of the occasion, gave his own careful account of what he had overheard near the granary. A former quartermaster, tracked down at last through Stirling's old regimental connections, provided a written record of Camille Duval's history with no fewer than 2 other officers of considerable fortune before Edmund, each attachment ending with remarkable consistency the very moment the officer's prospects began to dim, piece by careful piece, testimony by testimony. The case that had seemed impossible to build in that dark hour beside the dying fire became a structure as solid and undeniable as the stones of Blackwood itself. The hearing was held not in the private quiet of a magistrate's chamber, but, at the Duke's own insistence, in the great hall of Blackwood before a gathering of the county's finest families. For he had believed, in his considerable arrogance, that a public setting would cement Camille's place in society rather than expose the truth of it for all to see. The hall was full when Rosalind entered, dressed not in the morning grey some had expected, but in a gown the deep, unyielding blue of a winter sky. And Camille, seated beside the Duke in the very chair that had once been Rosalind's own, wore the same triumphant smile she had worn on the night she first crossed Blackwood's threshold in the rain. The Duke's solicitor rose first and spoke with practised smoothness of technical grounds and improper disclosure, and for a long, uncomfortable moment the room murmured its easy sympathy toward the powerful man rather than the quiet woman standing alone before them. For it is always simpler for a comfortable room to believe the one who commands it. Then the doors at the rear of the hall opened, and Gabriel Thorne Stirling walked in, wearing, for the first time in Rosalind's presence, the full dress and unmistakable bearing of an earl, and the murmuring in that hall changed its character entirely. For every family present recognized both the name and the considerable weight it carried in rooms far grander than this one. "You will forgive the interruption," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the silent hall. "But I find I have rather a great deal of evidence the court has not yet had the opportunity to consider." He did not raise his voice again. He did not need to. He laid before the magistrate a confirmed record of Rosalind's undisputed claim to the Ashford barony, rendering any question of her original dowry entirely beside the point, and beside it he laid the quartermaster's sworn testimony, the Hartleys' signed statement, young Tom's careful account, and a ledger 3 months in the painstaking reconstructing that traced every shilling Silas Crane had quietly diverted into an account shared quite openly once properly examined, with the very woman now sitting in borrowed sapphires at the Duke's own side.